At my son's award gala, the man who was about to become his father-in-law grabbed a full glass of red wine off a passing tray, walked the length of the ballroom, and poured the whole thing down the front of my chest. He leaned into the microphone and said, "Drink up, janitor. I'd hate for anyone to say I let the help go thirsty." 300 donors laughed. And before the wine had even soaked through to my undershirt, the chief of surgery at Halverson Memorial shoved back her chair, pointed a shaking finger at him, and shouted, "Have you lost your mind? That man owns this hospital." Friend, before we go any further, do me a small favor. Hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like mine only reach the people who need them when you help push them along. And leave a comment telling me where in this country you're watching from and what time it is where you sit. I read every single one, because here's what Preston Vale didn't know when he emptied that glass on me. 14 hours earlier, in the dark of a parking garage on Wacker Drive, I had already bought every dollar of the debt that was strangling him, at 40 cents on the dollar, from men who couldn't unload it fast enough. If you want to know how a quiet old man in a windbreaker took apart a celebrity surgeon in front of the wealthiest 300 people in Chicago, stay with me. It takes a while to tell it right. My name is Walter Denning. I'm 68 years old. That October evening, I drove my 1998 Chevy panel van down Michigan Avenue with the heater rattling and a thermos of black coffee sweating in the cup holder. That thermos is older than my son. The van still has ladder brackets welded to the roof from the years I ran wire and hung conduit for other men's buildings. The seats are patched with duct tape. The passenger door only opens if you lift it while you pull. On that patched seat beside me was a heavy cream-colored invitation with gold edges, the kind of paper that costs more per sheet than I used to make in an hour. It invited me to the Halverson Memorial Foundation Gala, where my only child, Daniel Denning, 29 years old, was to be named the youngest program director in that hospital's history. Tucked inside the envelope was a folded index card. It wasn't from Daniel. It was from my late wife's sister, Diane Marchetti, who had raised her flag over my son's life, the way a country raises a flag over land it didn't earn. The card said, "Walter, wear something dark. Sit at table 31. Please don't tell people what you did for a living." I read that card 4 times at a red light on Randolph Street. Then I put it in my pocket, because a man doesn't win a war by bleeding in the driveway. I want you to understand something about my hands before I tell you the rest. They're thick. The knuckles don't close all the way anymore. There's a scar across the left palm from a length of rebar in 1981. Those hands built Denning Industrial Systems from one used van and a borrowed ladder into a company that now holds the electrical and mechanical service contracts for 9 states, and a controlling interest in the holding company that owns 3 hospital systems, including Halverson Memorial. Nobody at that gala knew that. Not one soul. And that was not an accident, friend. That was a promise. My wife Ellen died when Daniel was 11. Before she got sick, before any of it, she made me sit at our kitchen table and swear something to her. Ellen came from money. Her father made a fortune in freight, and it destroyed every person it touched. Her brother drank himself out of the world at 34. Her cousins sued each other for 11 years over a lake house. Ellen used to say her family didn't have relationships. They had accounts. She held my wrist across that table and she said, "Walt, if we ever have it, that boy doesn't find out until he's built something with his own 2 hands. Let him earn a spine before he inherits a bank." I kept that promise. I kept it too long, and I'll answer for that. But I kept it. I parked the van 3 blocks away in a public lot, because I have never once let a valet touch that vehicle. I walked to the Regency Opera House in a navy blazer I bought at a department store outside Joliet, and a pair of black shoes with a crack across the right toe box, where the leather had finally given up. The lobby smelled like lilies and money. Women in silk moved past me like I was a coat rack. That's where I first met Dr. Preston Vale. He was 42, tan in October, with the kind of hair that costs $400 to look uncombed. A celebrity surgeon, the sort who does morning television segments about aging gracefully. He was also the father of Camille, the young woman my son intended to marry, and, through a management contract, the man who signed off on my son's schedule and my son's evaluations. He stopped directly in my path at the base of the marble stairs, looked at my cracked shoes, and held out a set of keys. "Pull it around to the north entrance," he said. "It's the blue Bentley. Mind the wheels, they cost more than your car." I didn't take the keys. I stood still and let the silence sit there long enough to get uncomfortable. The way you let a bad bolt soak before you turn it. I'm not with the valet service, I said. I'm Walter Denning, Daniel's father. The keys dropped. They hit the marble and skidded. For about a second and a half, something flickered across his face. A small recalculation. Then the smile came back, wide and empty as a parking lot at midnight. Right, he said, bending for the keys. Camille mentioned you might make it in from wherever it is. I just didn't expect the whole costume. He didn't offer his hand. He turned and snapped his fingers at a security man near the coat check and said, loud enough for me and everyone behind me, keep an eye on this gentleman. Make sure he doesn't wander into the donor lounge or help himself to the buffet. We've got board members arriving. Then he walked away laughing, one hand on a state senator's shoulder. Friend, I want to tell you what I felt, and it wasn't rage. I've sat across from union bosses who wanted to break me and bankers who wanted to bury me. What I felt was recognition. A man who treats a stranger like garbage the second he assumes that stranger is poor is a man who is desperately protecting something. Cruelty like that isn't strength. It's a tarp over a hole. My seat, table 31, was against the back wall beside the swinging doors to the kitchen. Every 40 seconds, those doors banged open and let out a wash of heat and clattering pans. I was seated as far from the head table as the room physically allowed. It was deliberate, and it was meant to be understood. I sat down and folded my hands on the tablecloth and watched. Diane found me before the salad course. She came across the floor in gray silk with a clipboard she didn't need, and her smile died about 6 feet out. I asked you to wear something dark, she said, low. It's navy. It's sad, Walter. She glanced at my shoes and something crossed her face like she'd smelled a drain. You look like you came to fix the furnace. These people are Daniel's future. Do you understand what tonight is worth to him? Then she opened her purse and pulled out 5 20s, crisp, and pushed them into my breast pocket and patted it twice. Take that. Get gas, get a room somewhere off the highway, and leave early tomorrow. We don't need your whole situation in the photographs. She walked away expecting me to explode. She had been waiting 17 years for me to explode, so she could finally point at me and say, see. I didn't give her that. I took the bills out of my pocket and smoothed them flat on the tablecloth. A minute later, a girl came out of the kitchen doors carrying a tub of dirty glassware that was too heavy for her. 19, maybe. Hair stuck to her forehead, forearms shaking. She had that specific exhaustion I remember in my own body from the winter of 1979, when I worked a double at a fabrication shop and then swept a bank lobby from 11 to 3, and $100 was the difference between the lights staying on and my wife crying quietly in the bathroom, so I wouldn't hear. As she passed, I slid the 5 20s under the edge of her tub. She stopped dead. She looked at the money, then at me, and her eyes went glassy. I put a finger to my lips and gave her a nod. She mouthed thank you and disappeared through the doors. That's the whole sermon, friend. Nobody in that ballroom had ever carried anything heavier than their own reputation. Then I turned my attention to Preston Vale, and I started doing what I've done for 45 years, which is watch a system and find where it's about to fail. He was holding court at the head table, ordering bottles of wine that ran $1,100, pouring for people who didn't ask, laughing a half beat too loud at his own jokes. But when the banquet captain leaned down and quietly set the preliminary charge folder beside his plate, I saw it. His jaw locked. The color went out under the tan. His hand shook for a quarter second before he clamped it around the stem of his glass. He signed and shoved the folder back like it had burned him, and his smile came back 2 seconds late. 2 seconds. That's an eternity, if you know how to count. Then I found my son. Daniel was near the auction tables in a rented tuxedo, tall and lean, looking so much like Ellen it still knocks the wind out of me. His shoulders were up around his ears. He was checking the room over my shoulder before he even said hello. Dad, hey, you made it. His voice dropped. You should probably stay at your table. Preston's people are circulating. I brought you something, I said. I reached into my jacket and took out a flat package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a photo album I'd bound myself, leather stretched and stitched by hand over 6 weeks in my garage, his initials pressed into the cover with a tool my own father used. Inside, I'd restored every drawing he made me between ages 4 and 9, the ones I'd kept in a coffee can in the basement, the crayon airplane, the house with the crooked chimney, the one that said Dad is strongest in letters that ran off the edge of the page. His face changed for 1 second. Just one, he remembered. Then panic swallowed it. His eyes went around the room and he pushed the package down into a chair like he was hiding a beer bottle from a teacher. Thanks, Dad. That's thank you. I'll look at it later, okay? Just please go sit down. Too late. Cologne arrived before the man did. What have we got here? Preston said, stepping between us and plucking the package out of the chair. He tore the paper with his thumb and held the album up under the chandelier, turning it over with theatrical curiosity while a dozen people watched. You make this yourself? He asked me. It's got that whole flea market authenticity. I stitched it, I said. It's a family thing. He laughed the way a man laughs when he's performing for a crowd. Well, Camille and I have upgraded the family traditions. Ours come in boxes with ribbons on them. He set the album down on a cocktail table, took a sweating glass of red off a passing tray, and set it directly on the leather cover. Makes a great coaster, though, he said. Thanks for pitching in, Wally. The condensation started spreading into the leather I'd spent 6 weeks working. Every muscle in my body wanted to take him by his collar and introduce him to the floor. I've broken bigger men than him across a conference table without raising my voice, but I've learned that if you strike while the animal is still testing the fence, it runs. You wait until it's all the way inside. And that's when the night broke open. A man shoved through the floral display behind us. He didn't belong. Windbreaker, cheap boots, a jaw like a shovel. He came straight at Preston and took hold of his shoulder from behind, hard enough that Preston's wine sloshed. Preston spun around ready to unload, and then he saw the man's face, and every ounce of blood left his own. His mouth opened and nothing came out. The man walked him backward into a service corridor, and the door swung shut behind them, and the string trio kept playing, and 300 people kept laughing, and not one of them noticed a thing. Camille had seen it. She was standing right there, smoothing her dress over and over. I asked her, kindly, who that man was. She gave me a bright, manufactured smile and a little laugh. Oh, that's just a vendor. Daddy's practice is expanding into the Gold Coast location, and contractors get pushy when a bid doesn't go their way. Then she tilted her chin up, and I watched Diane's whole education come out of a 26-year-old's mouth. It's a very high-pressure world, Mr. Denning, very different from what you're used to. And she lifted her left hand into the chandelier light to show me the ring. Friend, in 1994, my company wired the vaults for 2 of the largest jewelry wholesalers in the Midwest. I spent 11 months on those jobs. I sat and ate lunch with gemologists because they were the only people on site who'd talk to an electrician like a human being, and they taught me what to look for. Not size. Fire. The way a real stone bends light and throws color back at you out of its own center. That stone was big. It was cut clean. And it was dead. The light came off it flat and glassy, like a window. It was cubic zirconia in an antique platinum setting, and I knew that setting. I had bought it at a pawn shop on Devon Avenue in 1978 with 11 weeks of overtime, and I had put it on Ellen's finger in a church basement. Daniel had given his mother's ring to Preston Vale to have reset for Camille. My chest went cold, because that meant the real diamond, the one thing left in this world that Ellen had worn every day for 22 years, was gone. I made myself smile. I made myself say something pleasant, and then I went to work. 20 minutes later, I gave a valet attendant $100 and a story about a document locked in my future in-law's car. He handed me the fob to the blue Bentley without a word. The glove box held one folder. It wasn't from a dealership. It was an hourly exotic rental agreement out of a lot on the west side, 24 hours, beginning that afternoon, ending the next morning at 10. He'd rented that car by the hour so it could sit in front of an opera house all night. Under the passenger seat, crumpled, was a notice from the circuit court. Foreclosure proceedings on a lake house in Michigan, 11 months behind. And in the door pocket, folded into a square, was a receipt from an estate buyer on Wabash. Dated 3 months earlier, the same week Daniel got engaged. Item: 1 round brilliant diamond, removed from setting, paid in cash. I sat in that leather seat holding my wife's ring in the form of a receipt, and I understood that I was not dealing with a snob. I was dealing with a predator who was drowning, and my son was the log he intended to climb onto. I put everything in my inside pocket, locked the car, returned the fob, and walked back inside just in time to hear Preston Vale take the microphone. He told 300 donors that his surgical group had just closed a monumental partnership to build a 40-bed orthopedic pavilion on the Halvorsen campus. He said the paperwork was signed. He said it was the crown jewel of his career. The room applauded. Diane beamed. Camille glowed. And I sat at table 31 by the kitchen doors and drank my ice water because I had personally killed that pavilion proposal in a holding company meeting 9 weeks earlier. There was no partnership. There were no signatures. There was no pavilion. He had invented an entire building in front of the people who would fund it. Then his eyes searched the room and found my dark corner, and he leaned into the mic and said, "You know, some men spend 40 years pushing a broom and never build a single thing that outlasts them. Here's to evolution." His table laughed. Diane raised her glass. My son looked at his lap and said nothing. I did not move, because a lie that big, told to a room that rich, told me the clock on this man had almost run out. I slipped out through the kitchen and followed him into the loading alley behind the opera house 12 minutes later. He was alone by the dumpsters with a cheap prepaid phone pressed to his ear, and the man I'd watched all night was gone. What was left was a 42-year-old boy sweating through a tuxedo shirt in 40-degree air, begging. "You have to give me until Monday," he said. "Monday. I'm standing at the gala right now. No. Listen to me. The kid signs the foundation's grant authorizations the second the directorship is announced tomorrow night. His name unlocks the endowment disbursements. 6.2 million clears through the research account by Tuesday, and you're whole, with the premium. Just don't send anybody else to the venue. You spook that family and there's nothing." He listened. Whatever was said made him flinch like he'd been hit. "I'm not running," he whispered. "I'm telling you the truth. Just let the announcement happen." The line went dead. He threw the phone against the brick wall, and it burst apart, and he stood there with his hands on his knees, heaving. I stayed in the dark until he'd gone back inside. Then I drove to a motel on Ogden Avenue, sat on the edge of a bed with a comforter that smelled like bleach, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Sana Okafor, who has been my chief counsel for 19 years and has never once asked me to explain myself twice. "I need everything Preston Vale owes," I told her. "Every note, every position, every private lender, and I need to know what he's actually filing at Halvorsen, because a man doesn't need $6 million on a Tuesday because of a bad quarter." The second call was to a forensic auditor named Ruth Kellerman, and I woke her up, and she didn't complain. By 4 in the morning, I had the shape of it, and by 6, I had the whole ugly thing on paper. Preston Vale's outpatient surgical group was a shell wrapped around a hole. For 3 years, he had been billing procedures through a nonprofit he'd created, called the Vale Restorative Research Initiative, procedures that had never been performed, on patients who had been discharged weeks earlier. He'd taken $6.2 million from a private lending group that does not use courts to collect, and he'd used it to paper over the gap while he chased a permanent fix. The permanent fix was my son. Because the endowment disbursement authorizations at the Halvorsen Foundation require a program director's signature and a licensed physician's identification number, and on 11 of the fraudulent research filings already submitted, Ruth found a physician identification number that did not belong to Preston Vale. It belonged to Daniel Denning. He had used my son's credentials on federal filings. He had forged my son's signature. When that fraud unraveled, and it always unravels the name on the paperwork, the man the prosecutors would walk out in handcuffs would be my boy. He hadn't just planned to marry his daughter to my son. He'd built a trapdoor with Daniel standing on it. Sana bought the debt at 6:15 that morning, through a distressed asset vehicle we've used since 2011, 40 cents on the dollar. The lenders practically threw it at us. They'd already decided he was a flight risk, and they were thrilled to get anything at all. $2.48 million bought me every obligation, every marker, and every piece of leverage that had been squeezing that man's throat for 18 months. I did not overpay to be dramatic. I paid what a distressed note is worth, because that's what 45 years of business teaches you. And because the second that paper landed in my hands, Preston Vale stopped owing anything to anyone on this earth except me. The gala for my son's directorship was the following evening. I got there at 3 in the afternoon in the same navy blazer and the same cracked shoes. Diane spotted me inside of 10 minutes. She came marching across the empty ballroom with her earpiece in. "Perfect. Make yourself useful for once. The wine delivery is sitting on the dock. and the venue wants $200 to have their people carry it in. We are not paying $200 for something a man can do with his hands. 60 cases. Go. Now, friend. I could have ended that whole weekend with one phone call from a folding chair. I could have had her walked out of the building. But a trap only closes if the field looks empty. I needed them comfortable. I needed them absolutely certain that the old man in the cheap blazer was nothing. So I said, "All right, Diane." And I went out to the dock and I carried 60 cases of wine, 42 pounds each, up a service ramp and across 110 feet of ballroom floor, at 68 years old, in a rented tuxedo shirt that was already soaked through by case 9. Preston came out on the mezzanine with 4 of his colleagues, drinks in hand, and leaned on the rail to watch. "Boys," he called down, "I told you we hired a pack mule for the weekend." They laughed. One of them told me not to break a hip. I kept my head down. And every time they laughed, the phone in my trouser pocket buzzed against my leg. Buzz. The debt transfer had cleared and recorded. Buzz. Ruth's affidavit had been countersigned. Buzz. The federal filings had been submitted to the Office of Inspector General. Buzz. Halverson's chief of surgery, Dr. Miriam Hale, had reviewed the file and was on her way. Buzz. Sana had the warrants. Case 59. Case 60. I set the last one down and straightened my back. And up on that mezzanine, Preston Vale raised his glass to me, and he had no idea he was toasting the man who owned every breath he had left. I want to be honest with you about the ceremony, because it was the worst part. I sat in the back and watched my son walk to the podium and get named program director, and he was beautiful, and he thanked Preston Vale by name, and he thanked Diane, and when he got to me he said, "And my dad, who's here somewhere," and the room did not applaud, because nobody knew which one I was. Dinner ran long. Preston drank like a man who'd already won, and when the plates came down and the room quieted, he took the microphone off its stand and started walking toward the back of the ballroom, and every head turned to follow him. He stopped at my table with a full glass of Bordeaux. "We're surrounded tonight by extraordinary people," he said, "and the speakers carried it into every corner. But let's not forget those who never quite got there. Charity begins at home." Then he tipped the glass and poured it down my chest, slow, all of it, and said into the microphone, "Drink up, Janitor." I'd hate for anyone to say I let the help go thirsty. For 1 second the room was silent. Then his colleagues broke, and the laughter went through that ballroom like a wave. Diane's face split into pure satisfaction. Camille covered her mouth, and my son stood 20 feet away and did not move. I stayed perfectly still. I did not wipe my face. I looked straight up into his eyes and let him have his moment. And then a chair scraped back at table 2, hard enough to bark across the floor. Dr. Miriam Hale stood up. 61 years old, chief of surgery, 31 years at Halverson, and she was the color of a stop sign. "Have you lost your mind?" she shouted, and the room went dead. She came across the floor and slapped his outstretched hand away from her. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" "Miriam, relax," he said, and his voice had already gone up an octave. "He's a maintenance guy. He is Walter Denning." Her voice cracked across the ballroom like a board snapping. "He is the controlling partner of the holding company that owns this hospital. He owns the building your office is in. He signs the contract your entire practice group operates under. And the pavilion you announced last night, Preston? He killed it. In committee, 9 weeks ago. 300 people inhaled at the same time. It made a sound I will never forget. Diane's glass hit the floor and shattered, and she didn't even look down. I reached over and picked up a linen napkin and wiped my face, slowly, taking my time, letting the room finish doing what it was doing. Then I stood up out of that chair to my full height, and I watched Preston Vale realize that he had spent 2 days kicking a man who had been standing still on purpose. "Dad?" Daniel said from somewhere behind me. His voice sounded 11 years old. "Dad, is that true?" I didn't answer him yet. I reached into my jacket and took out a sealed courier envelope with the Denning Industrial crest on it, and I tossed it at Preston's chest. He fumbled and it hit the floor and burst, and the documents fanned out across the parquet in front of 300 donors. "Your research initiative doesn't exist," I said, and I did not raise my voice. And every person in that room heard every word. "It has no patients. It has no trials. It has no board. It has been a billing conduit for 38 months. and there are 106 procedures in those filings that were never performed on human beings. Somebody at a front table stood up and walked out fast, phone already at his ear. "Camille," I said, and she flinched. "Take that ring off, sweetheart. It's glass. 3 months ago, your father took the ring my son gave him, my wife's ring, the one I bought with overtime in 1978, and he pulled the stone out of the setting and sold it to an estate buyer on Wabash for cash, and he had a piece of cubic zirconia mounted in its place. He told you it was an upgrade." She looked at her father. She begged him with her whole face to say it wasn't so. He looked at the floor, and that was the answer. Then I stepped close enough that only the microphone he'd dropped could pick me up. "And you borrowed $6.2 million from people who don't file lawsuits, but you didn't sign for it alone, did you? On 11 federal filings, you used my son's physician identification number. You forged his signature. You set that boy up to be the name on the indictment while you walked out with the money." Daniel made a sound behind me like something tearing. "As of 6:15 yesterday morning," I said, "my company purchased that entire debt. You don't owe those men anything anymore, Preston. You owe me, and I am calling every dollar of it. Right now. Tonight." His legs went out from under him. He went down on the parquet in his tuxedo, and then he crawled. I want you to hear that, friend. He crawled across that floor and grabbed the cracked leather of my shoe with both hands. "Please, Mr. Denning, please. I'll work for you. I'll do anything. Don't let them take me." I looked down at the man who pawned my wife's ring and put my son's name on a felony, and I felt nothing but a cold, clean disgust. "You can't repair a foundation that was never poured," I said, and I pulled my foot back. Then I raised my hand and snapped my fingers once. The ballroom doors opened. Sana Okafor came down the center aisle in a charcoal suit with 4 federal agents behind her, and 300 of the wealthiest people in Chicago pressed back against their tables to clear a path. They took Preston Vale up off that floor by his elbows and cuffed him, and he screamed all the way down the aisle, and it echoed off the chandeliers, and nobody helped him. Diane got to me before the doors closed. She had her hands out and a smile pasted on that made me sick. Walter, darling, why on earth didn't you tell us? We would have treated you so differently. We're family." "That's the whole problem, Diane," I said. "You would have treated me differently. That's not family. That's pricing." I looked past her at the foundation's board chair, who was standing 3 feet away. "Effective tonight. She's off the foundation board. Have counsel handle it in the morning." She started to say my name, and I walked past her. "Now here's the part, friend, where you probably expect me to tell you I put my arm around my son and forgave him, and we drove off, and everything was warm. That's not what happened. Daniel came to me in that emptying ballroom with tears running down his face, saying he was sorry, saying he was so blind, saying he should have stood up. And I said, 'I know you're sorry, son. I believe you, but you watched a man pour wine on your father in front of 300 people, and your feet didn't move.' I put my hand on the side of his face, because he's my boy and he always will be. I'm not angry, but I'm not ready either. Come find me when you can tell me what you saw tonight without explaining it away." Then I walked out to my van and I drove home alone, and that was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than the wine, harder than the 60 cases. He called me 11 days later and asked for a job, not a job in an office. He asked for the loading bay at our fabrication plant in Cicero, 3rd shift, no last name on the schedule, no special treatment, and the crew chief didn't know who he was for 4 months. He got up at 4 in the morning for 8 months. He came home with his hands split open. He learned what 42 pounds feels like on your shoulder at hour 9. And on a Sunday in June, he showed up at my kitchen table with the leather album under his arm, the one with the water ring still in the cover. And he opened it to the crayon airplane and he cried like he was 9 years old. And then I put my arms around my son. Preston Vale is serving 11 years in a federal facility for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. His license is gone. The lending group he borrowed from is under indictment. Daniel's name was cleared on the record, publicly, in front of the same donors who watched him get humiliated. Camille left her father's house, finished her degree in Minneapolis, and sends me a card every Christmas, and I answer every one. Diane sold the condo and moved to Scottsdale. She has not called. I never got Ellen's diamond back. The estate buyer sold it 11 days after he bought it, and there's no tracing it. Some things you don't recover, you just carry them. So here's what I want you to take with you tonight, friend, because you sat with me all this way. Predators don't look like monsters. They look like the most successful man in the room. They have good teeth and better stories, and they are always the one telling you what things are worth. And the ones who need to humiliate somebody smaller in order to feel large are never strong. They're hollow, and they're loud about it, because hollow things ring. Never measure a man by his shoes, or his truck, or the calluses on his hands. The quietest person in the room is very often the one holding the deed. And if you're a parent watching this at whatever hour it is where you are, your job was never to be liked. Your job is to still be standing there when the beautiful illusion falls apart. Love your kids enough to let them be wrong, and love them enough to make them earn their way back. Both of those things are love. I've done both, and only one of them felt good. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe so it finds the next person who needs it. And do me that favor I asked for at the start. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what time it is in your city, and what you would have done if you'd been sitting at table 31. Stay steady, trust your gut, and I'll see you in the next one.